Welcome to the Deep Dive. We're looking at a week marked by, well, significant security challenges across Eastern Europe. Our focus, as always, is to bring you, our listener, a factual, contextual, and impartial view of these developments. Tonight, we're honing in on the substantial escalation in the Russia-Ukraine conflict and, importantly, the ripple effects that are now stretching into NATO territory.
Yes, and our aim today is really to cut through the noise, the complexity. We've distilled information from quite a range of sources: traditional news, diplomatic statements, open source intelligence, even social media analysis. So this deep dive is structured to give you a clear, neutral briefing on the recent actions, the shifting diplomatic stances, and, what it all means strategically.
Okay, and before we dive in, just a quick word about the technology behind this analysis. This deep dive is brought to you by ProWave AI, and it's generated by Stylo News, the AI-powered news application that turns global data into actionable intelligence. Right, let's begin with the immediate situation, the kinetic reality on the ground. The last days of September 2025, they saw a really dramatic increase in Russian aerial attacks.
That's right, a sharp increase in both intensity and scale.
Centered mainly on Kiev.
Overwhelmingly on Kiev and the regions surrounding it, yes. Sources are consistent, describing the attacks on September 28th and 29th using drones, missiles, as the most massive we've seen since the start of the full-scale war.
And with attacks of that scale, there's inevitably a human cost.
There is, and it's crucial we address that first. The sheer volume hitting urban areas. It tragically led to verified civilian casualties. Reports confirm at least 4 deaths in Kyiv, including the really heartbreaking loss of a 12-year-old girl, Sasha. And you saw tens of thousands of residents immediately heading for shelter in those deep underground metro stations.
Still serving as vital shelters, then?
Absolutely, against these, overwhelming threats.
Now, beyond Ukraine itself, you mentioned ripple effects. We saw immediate regional reactions, didn't we? Specifically from Poland.
We did. Poland took very swift, very visible preventive action.
What did that involve?
Well, they scrambled military aircraft.
Right.
And they proactively closed airspace near 2 cities in the southeast, Lublin and Rizzo.
For how long?
Until 4 a.m. local time. Now, looking at the strategic angle here, this action, it speaks volumes.
Because of Rizzo's role.
Exactly. Rizzo isn't just any city. It's the critical NATO logistics hub for aid flowing into Ukraine. Scrambling jets there, closing airspace. It shows that this perceived threat of, spillover effects isn't theoretical anymore. It's being treated as a tangible risk, specifically to that vital NATO supply line.
Which naturally brings up defenses. How did Ukraine respond tactically to such a huge air assault?
We saw air defenses activated right across the country. And critically, sources are highlighting the successful use of Israeli-supplied Patriot air defense systems.
That's significant, the Patriots being deployed effectively.
It is. And the insight here goes beyond just getting aid. Patriot batteries are high-value, limited assets. Successfully using them against complex, layered Russian attacks isn't just a military win for Kiev, it's also a major political validation, demonstrating that advanced Western hardware can be effective against current Russian systems.
Okay, let's shift focus slightly. From the immediate battlefield to the broader risks. Critical infrastructure safety, especially nuclear, it remains a constant concern.
Yes. And what's both fascinating and, frankly, deeply worrying is the ongoing situation at Zaporizhia, the nuclear power plant.
Still Russian-occupied.
Still occupied, yes,
What?
and it's now been offline for 4 days straight. That means it's relying entirely on backup diesel generators for essential functions, mostly cooling systems.
4 days just on backup generators? That sounds inherently unstable. What's the specific technical risk there?
Well, relying on diesel for this long, it dramatically increases the safety concerns. These plants need constant power, not just for monitoring the reactor core, but crucially, for circulating coolant through the spent fuel pools.
Right.
If the diesel runs out or if the generators fail, and that risk grows every hour they operate, the cooling could fail, which could lead to overheating and potentially a release of radioactive material. It's a real crisis point.
And the blame game continues.
Unfortunately, yes. Both Russia and Ukraine continue to blame each other for attacks on the external power lines feeding the plant.
Alongside the military volatility, the information space seems just as charged. We've seen a rise in some very specific narratives this past week.
That's correct. A concerted push, it seems, from certain Russian and some Hungarian propaganda outlets. They're pushing a highly controversial story, accusing Ukraine of preparing a, quote, false flag operation.
What's the claim exactly?
The claim is that Ukraine plans to use repaired Russian drones to attack logistics hubs inside NATO countries, Poland and Romania specifically. with the alleged aim of drawing the entire NATO alliance directly into the war.
These false flag stories aren't new, but the timing seems significant now, doesn't it? Right when Poland is reacting to actual incursions near that key hub, Rezerazo, is Russia trying to shape the narrative in advance?
That's precisely the question analysts are asking. The timing suggests a couple of strategic aims. First, maybe to muddy the waters internationally if any cross-border incident does happen, who is really responsible? And second, it could be a signal that Russia sees increased NATO logistics activity itself as aggressive, an attempt to deter Western aid. And this contrasts sharply with Russia's official line, which denies targeting NATO or EU territory, though they simultaneously issue these stark warnings of a decisive response to any perceived aggression from outside.
So if you connect these two things, the strikes near NATO borders and this intense propaganda, how does the alliance view this delicate situation?
Well, NATO seems to view these close calls and the information warfare as deliberate tests. Tests of its resolve, its cohesion. The alliance is walking a very fine line,
How so?
trying to show strong collective defense capabilities to deter further incidents, but without giving Russia any pretext to claim NATO is directly involved in fighting, which of course can risk a much wider direct confrontation.
All right, let's turn to the diplomatic arena, the positions of the key decision makers. Peace talks seem, well, stalled.
It's maybe worse than stalled. Sources suggest a hardening Russian stance. U.S. Vice President J.D. Vance recently reported that Russia has flat-out rejected peace talks.
Both bilateral and trilateral talks?
Yes, involving Ukraine and the U.S. rejected them. This seems to confirm that for Moscow, despite any international pressure, a military solution remains the preferred path, at least for now.
And how is Moscow articulating this hardened stance?
We hear it clearly from Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov. His viewpoint is consistent. He frames NATO's eastward expansion as the root cause, the provocation leading to the conflict. He says Russia is ready for dialogue, but only about the conflict's origins, and strictly on Russia's terms.
And Ukraine's territorial claims?
He firmly rejects any discussion of Ukraine's claims beyond the borders as they stood in early 2022.
And on the other side, what's the message from Kyiv?
President Zelensky and the Ukrainian leadership, their message is twofold. Inwardly, focusing on national resilience. Outwardly, stressing the absolute need for continuous Western support. They're condemning these massive attacks, using the civilian casualties as evidence for why they need continued, even stronger military and economic backing to push back against these Russian advances on infrastructure and, population centers.
We also saw what could be a notable shift in rhetoric from Washington recently. President Trump acknowledging Ukraine's potential to regain territory with Allied support. What's the practical meaning of that shift?
That shift in language is quite relevant, especially for alliance unity. It moves away from earlier talk that might have hinted at pushing for immediate territorial concessions from Ukraine.
Right.
For European allies, particularly those on the eastern flank, hearing that acknowledgement signals a reaffirmed U.S. commitment to Ukraine's ultimate success. And that's crucial as the alliance looks ahead to planning aid packages for late 2025 and into 2026.
And finally, on the international stage, the major bodies seem to be struggling to have much impact.
The IAEA, the nuclear watchdog, is expressing grave concern about Zaporizhzhia, urging cooperation for safety. That's clear. But the UN Security Council remains, fundamentally paralyzed.
This is a veto.
Exactly. Russia's veto power prevents any decisive international action or binding resolutions. It effectively hobbles diplomatic efforts at that level due to the very structure of the institution.
Okay, to really give you the clearest picture, we need to look at the source material itself. How are these events being discussed, digested online?
Well, first, the traditional, reputable international outlets, Reuters, Al Jazeera, Sky News, the Jerusalem Post, they generally corroborate the basic facts. The scale, the intensity of the attacks on the 28th and 29th. That gives us a consistent factual baseline. But the really interesting data perhaps comes from the digital sphere, which is highly polarized.
Our Stylo News analysis of sentiment on X, formerly Twitter, maps this divide quite clearly. How exactly does Stylo News track that? It sounds complex.
Our AI looks at things like keyword clusters, it scores source veracity, tracks engagement patterns, basically mapping which narratives are being amplified by which groups. We don't just count posts, we see who is boosting which sources. So for instance, Ukrainian sources like Focus.ua or KievEUPost.com, they tend to get positive sentiment mostly from Western users. The discussion emphasizes resilience, NATO aid, often using hashtags like #Ukraine, #UNOTO.
And the opposing narrative. How does that look?
Conversely, Russian state media outlets like Iza.ru, Korea.ru, They get strong positive support, but almost exclusively from overtly pro-Russian audiences. They amplify state narratives about military success, anti-NATO rhetoric, typically using hashtags like hashtag Russia, hashtag military. The narratives are almost completely separate worlds.
But you mentioned one exception to that clear split, the Moscow Times.
Yes, that's a fascinating case. It draws really mixed sentiment, and this is a key insight,
You
actually,
say mixed?
because the Moscow Times often publishes reporting critical of the Kremlin. So it appeals strongly to anti-Kremlin voices worldwide, but at the same time, it draws intense negative reactions from Russian nationalist accounts. It almost acts like a barometer, showing the tension within the broader Russian language information space itself.
Is there any common thread running through this fractured online discussion?
If there is one, it's perhaps a mood of cautious optimism about Ukraine's defensive abilities, particularly reports about holding key areas like the Pokrovsk axis. But, and this is a big but, that optimism is heavily weighed down by growing frustration. Frustration over the slow, grinding Russian advances and just the sheer attritional nature of this war.
So, pulling all this analysis together, what does it suggest for the near future? Based on the data, what are the key things you should be watching?
Militarily, definitely keep a very close eye on the Pokrovsk axis. We need to watch for any signs of Russia committing significant heavy armor there that would signal a potential shift in strategy. Or, conversely, decisive Ukrainian countermoves.
Because Pokrovsk is so strategic.
It's a vital gateway. Its stability really dictates the front line in that whole sector. Also, monitor the patterns of drone and missile strikes, especially Ukraine's counterstrikes hitting Russian depots. That could signal escalating efforts around air control.
And on the diplomatic and policy side,
Watch for NATO's next practical steps on airspace security, any new agreements or coordination, especially along that eastern flank. And also, track the details around U.S. administration policy shifts or specifics on those aid packages expected later this year or early next. And maybe most critically, given the inherent danger, continued monitoring of Zaporizhia, the power supply, the safety status, any potential IAEA follow-up inspections, that remains paramount. Because a nuclear incident, even a small one, would completely reshape the conflict's dynamics. Before we wrap up, here's a final thought for you to consider. It touches on the long-term geopolitical challenge highlighted by this crisis. The paralysis we've seen at the UN Security Council, mainly due to the veto power, it has really reignited serious debate about reforming or even restructuring the Council itself. The question is the current structure still fit for purpose in an era of renewed great power conflict? Or is fundamental institutional change needed?
a profound question indeed for you to reflect on after processing this week's information. We want to remind you that the comprehensive data and the synthesis for this deep dive were created by Stylo News. Stylo News aggregates information from numerous traditional news sources and social media platforms like X, using advanced AI to bring clarity. To get AI-powered news on demand and stay ahead of developments, we encourage you to subscribe to Stylo News. You can do that by visiting www.stylonews.com.
Thank you for joining us for this important briefing. We appreciate you trusting the deep dive to provide context and clarity on these complex global events.
We do encourage you to tune in for more Stylo News reports. And please follow us on your favorite social media platforms. Until next time, be well and stay informed.